Dr. Samantha Chapman has been a professor and scientist at Villanova University in Pennsylvania since 2007. She's currently the co-director of the Center for Biodiversity and Ecosystem Stewardship and runs the WETFEET project. She is an ecosystem ecologist who is interested in how climate change and altered biodiversity change the services that ecosystems provide. She has received grants from NASA, the United States National Science Foundation, NOAA, the United States Forest Service, the United States Department of Agriculture to conduct her research. Sam and her team collaborate to understand how climate change and rising sea levels alter coastal ecosystems. And today she's going to be sharing about warming and mangrove encroachment and how it alters below ground processes with positive implications for surface elevation maintenance at the GTM Research Reserve. And with that, Sam, I will go ahead and pass it over to you.
Thanks so much, Caitlin. Appreciate it. So I'm so happy to be here today. Thanks to Caitlin and Abby for all their hard work. As Stephanie said earlier, getting this together. I really enjoyed the Sip and Science the other night. I thought that was such a cool way to do a poster session. And so I'm really looking forward to all the talks today as well. And the ones we've already heard this morning were great. I've worked in a lot of different field sites in Florida and really, throughout the country. I've worked with sites run by Smithsonian and NASA. And I've always been looking for a place to work over the past decade or so that felt like the science that we were doing really mattered for management, in which I was able to kind of communicate with managers and stakeholders and the people that are really caring for these amazing lands that we all love. And I feel like I've sort of finally found my research home away from home in Pennsylvania at the GTM Research Reserve. I feel so lucky to be working with people like Caitlin and Josie and Nikki and Scott and Leah and Pam and Gabby and the other Caitlin and Abby and so many more of you as part of this project and the other projects that we're doing. So I'll just say that really the fun of this is working with all of those people. I love being in these special places, but at this point on the WETFEET project, I think we've had, I tried to count again this morning, about at least 40 people that I know of that have actually been out and working on this project or working at Villanova on this project or in various parts of the country with our partner institutions. But I know that there are more of you. So I'd like to say thank you to all the volunteers that have trudged out in the mud, carrying heavy equipment and being a part of doing what I think is really important science. So thank you for doing that. So I just wanted to sort of set the stage for where we are in terms of Florida and sea level rise. So the last time the Earth was this warm, you can see in panel A here, much of Florida, including the area where we would normally be sitting today, was underwater. And that's because of the sea levels were so much higher. During the glacial period, of course, sea levels dropped and there was much more land available around where Florida is today. And then we think about present day Florida. And so I wanted to kind of orient you to this and remind many of you of this, because I think it's important to think about where we've been in terms as compared to sort of where we're going. So as many of you know, mangroves are increasingly, and as Nikki really nicely showed in her presentation, are increasingly encroaching into the salt marshes in Florida. And I really do think of this as kind of nature adapting to climate change. And we can, I think, learn some things from the way that nature adapts to climate change. But so that sort of forces us to think about mangroves in particular. And so I just wanted to share a figure from this recent paper that came out by Neil Santlin and some colleagues in Australia, looking at the history of mangroves around the world. And so they looked in various places using some pretty sophisticated techniques, looking back in old cores to see, when did mangroves really come around in our modern day? When did they start? And so what you can see here is that about 10,000 years ago, the sea levels were rising way too rapidly for mangroves or salt marshes to actually be able to establish and grow. And the mangroves in Florida started growing around 6,000 years ago. And so 6,000 years ago, you can see that in this kind of phase 2 here. And this is a Caribbean site, but it's very similar for Florida. The mangroves started growing and they've been building elevation since, and I'll talk about that in a second. So mangroves have been growing in this area now for about 6,000 years. And I think it's important to think about how they do that and how wetlands in general build soil. And so again, if we sort of start at that 10,000 year ago point and we think about the sea level rise rapidly happening, no wetlands could really establish. And then if we sort of move into the more recent present, around that 8 to 6,000 years ago, we think about the marshes and mangroves, these little green plants could be either, kind of building elevation over time. And they're doing this building of elevation both through growing roots and through capturing sediment. And they've been able to do this over the past 6,000 years because the sea level rise rate has been such that they can maintain their position with respect to sea level. And so this brings us to the question that we are really trying to get at, and you'll hear more questions directly addressing some of this, or some more talks about this later today. But what happens now, right? We know that sea level rise is going up rapidly, and we know that that can have the effect of drowning these marshes and mangroves. And so what do we need to know about these plants and ecosystems in order to figure out how well they're going to keep up? And so I just want to remind you that we are seeing mangroves rapidly encroaching into the reserve. And as Nikki said, I think it is a real need to sort of know how rapidly that's happening in these areas. And so hopefully there are some people that can contribute to that effort. But as these mangroves arrive on the beaches, they wash up and further into the marsh, and then they grow and sort of spread over the marsh, and really, in many cases, have sort of taken over and formed an entirely new ecosystem. So that's where the WETFEET project comes in. So we're trying to understand both mangrove encroachment and warming and how they are both influencing the way that these ecosystems can keep up with sea level rise. And so this project's being done in partnership with Smithsonian scientists, obviously all the wonderful people at the reserve, Mark Hester from the University of Louisiana, and Harris, who you'll hear from today, Jim Morris from South Carolina, Nikki, of course, as I mentioned, and Adam Langley from Villanova, and many others. So our questions really are, as I just sort of laid out pictorially, but I'll say it again in this schematic, is how are mangrove invasion and warming going to influence the processes like root growth and decomposition? These are the two I'll focus on today. How are they going to influence elevation change so that we know, where I showed you in that schematic, how marshes and mangroves keep up with sea level rise? Will they keep up? So we have 3 sites where there are fewer mangroves, intermediate mangroves, and most established mangroves within the reserve. And I'll call these sites north, middle, and south today. And we have warming experiments at them. So these warming experiments are at these 3 sites, and we have 6 plots that are warming marshes, 6 plots that are warming mangroves, 6 plots that are controlled marshes, and 6 parts that are controlled mangroves. And you can see these chambers here, and I'll give credit to Mike Dixon and this great site ID design by Gabby Canis, in which we can actually see where these chambers are, where we're at, right? Are we at a mangrove plot? Are we at a marsh plot? We should see that when we're on the ground, but we can also see this through the air with drones, which is really cool. And so the chambers look like this. This is some micro equipment inside, and we can stand on these nice platforms on the side here. And again, I really have to give a shout out to Gabby, because she and many of you volunteers, as well as people that work at the reserve, we can come down. We try to come down, 5 times a year in normal conditions, but that's been harder over the last year, of course. But they are have been responsible for maintaining these chambers and keeping them up, even in the wake of tropical storms and stuff like that. So that's really important for the functioning of this project. And so what we're measuring decomposition, which is the loss of organic matter in the soil. We're measuring decomposition in a different way at sort of different depths. And then we are also measuring rooting growth. So how many roots are growing into the soil in order that it is pushed up over time such that it can keep up with sea level rise. And so we're doing this in both mangrove and marsh plots, and warmed plots and controlled plots. And so the first thing I'll tell you is that the temperature data is working. So temperature treatments are working. So we're getting about 1.5 to 2 degrees Celsius increases, which is what's predicted for Florida over the next few decades. And the warming effect that we're seeing is highest in the summer. I'll just note that in the chambers, people often ask about chamber effects. There's no differences in humidity or pore water salinity between the warmed and controlled plots. And so what did we find? In terms of the way plants are growing above ground, which is of course important for the way that they will grow below ground, because the photosynthetic material that they're making above ground is what gets shunted below ground. We're seeing, perhaps not surprisingly, that plants are growing more, the mangroves in particular, are growing more with warming. They are tropical plants, subtropical plants. They've moved into these more temperate ecosystems, and they are doing well under warmer conditions. And you can see this across all 3 sites as indicated by the red lines here. And here we're looking at stem elongation, and this is a 1-year plot. We weren't able to take this measurement this year because we weren't able to get there. So in some cases, we're seeing 1 to 3 meters of growth in a year, which is an enormous amount of growth. And another thing to note is that the southern site, the mangroves are growing the fastest, which you can see here from this curve on the right. This is also shown in the canopy area and the height data. You can see here that the mangroves are growing taller. And one of the interesting things about tree height that we're finding, and we're using some remote sensing products as well to sort of collaborate or corroborate this with like LiDAR data, you can look at this in other ways, is that actually the plants are growing tallest more quickly, or the warming effect, I guess I should say, is most pronounced at the northern site, which is pretty interesting, that where we're not necessarily seeing colder temperatures using our micrometeorological equipment, but we are seeing the mangroves there are actually responding to warming more than they are at the middle or the south side. And that's also the case for the sort of canopy area as these mangroves spread out over the marsh. So the marsh, however, I should say, is not responding in any great way to warming, which is really interesting. In other places where we've done these kinds of experiments, like near at the Kennedy Space Center, we have seen marsh responses to warming. With Spartina dominated marshes and Baetis dominated marshes, we are not seeing that. So what about below ground? I told you this is kind of the key to understanding how well these marshes and mangroves are keeping up with sea level rise. And I apologize for this rather busy graph, but one of my former graduate students, Emily, collected a lot of data. And so I wanted to share this with you across the 3 sites. And I'll just kind of tell you about a major pattern of, involving these data. Here we're looking at the grams per meter squared of roots growing into plots that are in mangrove plots and marsh plots. And you'll see the red dots here are warm sites and the blue dots are control plots. And so the major pattern I want you to take away here is there's mangroves that are warmed are growing more roots than all the other treatments. And that's the case across all 3 sites, as you can see here from these kind of averages that are elevated over all the other treatments. So they have higher root productivity, and both because of mangroves being in the plots and because of warming. And I think the good news, and this is something that I've been like waiting with bated breath for these data to come in, is what about decomposition? As organic matter is broken down in soils, that can lead to the loss of surface elevation. So if we lose surface elevation because of increased decomposition, perhaps because mangroves are delivering more oxygen to the soil, or because there's more growth and there's therefore more tissues that are kind of bringing different kinds of litter into the soil, perhaps we would see more decomposition because of the presence of mangroves or the presence of warming. And that's not the case. We're not seeing any differences in decomposition of organic matter in any plots due to any treatments, which seems like kind of a boring effect, but in fact, it's really exciting to us. Thank you, Caitlin, because I think that that tells us that this encroachment of mangroves and potential future warming, that the potential warming we will see at these sites, is not going to increase organic matter decomposition, at least as far as we've seen so far, such that we will hopefully not see a decrease in surface elevation because of these 2 global change factors. And so I think we've answered some of these questions. We've said that warming can influence mangrove growth and therefore their encroachment sort of over the marshes. And we're starting to see this more and more with some of our new data. We can see that mangrove encroachment and warming can increase root growth. We're seeing no changes in decomposition. And I'll just say that later today, you're going to hear about some of these other factors. You'll hear from Harris about the way that warming of the soil affects these processes. One of my students, Nicole, is working on crabs and burrowing the soil with mangroves to see how that changes soil processes. You're going to hear from Gabby about her cool work on some of the microbenthos algae that are in these soils. Demir is working on seedlings and how well they're growing at different sea levels. Ches is going to talk to us about the actual elevation change, which is really crux and key to this. Matt Sturcio is working on the physiology of the plants in response to warming in mangroves versus marshes. And finally, you'll hear about some models that we've been working on. Nikki mentioned one earlier with this new U project where we're looking at coastal vulnerability, and that's sort of kicked off in the WETFEET project, and Greg had a great poster on that earlier in the poster session this week. And Phil did as well, looking at boat wakes, which he identified as one of the major needs. And then you'll hear from Jim today about a model that he has built just for this project to look at how mangroves and marshes are keeping up with sea level rise in the reserve. And so with that, I think I'll just stop, take any questions.
Great. Thank you so much, Sam. We do have a few questions that have come in through the chat box. Could the differences in nutrient levels in the sediment across the 3 sites impact the increases in growth in one site over another?
So that is a great question. And there is someone here that is measuring that, which is really exciting. So if you want to put that into the chat with the pore water data, that would be awesome. I do think that's a really important direction to go, is to figure out, and Nikki identified this, and this is something we've been kind of thinking about with WETFEET research, is so what happens with these added nutrients? You know, there's been some really important findings with nutrients decreasing, increasing channel widening. There's reason to think there's a fertilization experiment in one of our sites where mangroves are doing a lot better with more nutrients. We don't necessarily know that about the marshes as well as much. So I think that's an important next step. Good question.
Great. Thank you so much. Are the mangroves growing faster, or are the mangroves that are growing faster younger than the plants that aren't? Perhaps younger plants devote more of their energy to somatic growth, so they get bigger fast?
That is such a great question. And it was a really key one for us in working up this 2 years of data that I just showed you. And so Candy Feller and I actually went back to using this great method she has and aged all of the trees. We tried to pick trees that were sort of the same size to start with, but that didn't tell us about their age, as you're suggesting. And in fact, they're all across the 3 sites around the same age, but they are growing at different rates. And it seems like that southern site, they're growing much faster. And so, while there's not a difference in age, there's a difference, certain trees have different ages, but they're all between kind of 7 and 11 years on average, the trees and the plots. And so it doesn't seem to be age driven. It's a great question.
Great. Thank you so much.